They say that on a small island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, there's a church whose bells have not rung for more than 100 years. Not because they're broken, not because the people forgot, but because the last time those bells rang, something terrible answered. This is the story of the silent bells of St. Helena. There's a place far out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, so remote it feels like the end of the world. A patch of green and black rock, surrounded by miles and miles of endless water. That place is the island of St. Helena. You can't get there easily. No planes land there at night. No ships come by unless they mean to. It's the kind of place that feels untouched, as if time itself forgot it exists. But St. Helena has a strange kind of silence, a silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels watched, like the island itself is holding its breath. In the 1800s, St. Helena was known as a prison island. The British used it to keep the world's most unwanted people, soldiers, traitors, and one very famous man, Napoleon Bonaparte. He lived his final years there, staring out over the cliffs, dreaming of escape, until death finally took him. But Napoleon wasn't the only ghost that stayed. Locals say that long before his exile, before there were even paved roads, strange things happened on that island. Ships that came near the coast would lose their compasses. Fishermen would vanish without a splash, and every now and then, people said they could hear bells ringing out across the water, even though no church stood on the cliffs at that time. When settlers finally built one, a small stone chapel overlooking the sea, they said it was to bring God's voice to the island. But maybe the island already had a voice of its own, one that didn't want to be silenced. The church was simple: white stone, wooden pews, a tall bell tower that faced the ocean. It became the heart of the small community: baptisms, weddings, funerals. And when the wind blew the right way, you could hear the waves crashing below like a heartbeat. At the very top of that tower hung 2 massive bronze bells, shipped all the way from England. It took 3 weeks to mount them. The blacksmith who inspected them said the tone they made was unlike any he'd heard. Deeper, heavier, almost human. No one thought much of it at the time, but a few villagers said the bells made the air around them vibrate, like they were breathing. Still, the priest, Father Armitage, brushed it off. He said the bells were gifts from heaven, but some gifts don't come from heaven. Long pause. For a while the island felt calm, but everyone noticed something strange. Animals avoided the church grounds. Dogs would whimper and pull their chains when the bells were mentioned. And at night, the sea around the cliffs made sounds that didn't match the tide. Deep, hollow noises that echoed like distant drums. Then came the morning the bells rang for the first time, and everything changed. Low, ominous note begins. It was a Sunday morning in the spring of 1821, the kind of morning when the sea looks like glass and the air feels too still. The sky was gray, and a thick fog had rolled in from the water. The islanders said it wasn't normal fog. It came too fast, too heavy, and it didn't move with the wind. The church stood silent on the cliffs that day. Inside, candles flickered against the damp walls. Families gathered, their whispers bouncing softly between the pews. Father Armitage stood at the altar, his hands trembling slightly as he read the sermon. It was the first Sunday since the bells had been installed, and everyone had come to hear them ring. When the time came, 2 altar boys pulled on the ropes. At first, nothing happened. The bells hung motionless, almost resisting. Then, slowly, one of them moved. The sound rolled over the island, deep, heavy, and hollow. It wasn't a joyful chime. It sounded more like something calling out from underwater. Everyone inside the church froze. Some said the ground beneath their feet vibrated. Others said the air grew colder, thick enough to taste. And then, through the fog outside, they heard it. A second bell. But this one didn't come from the tower. It came from far away, out past the cliffs, somewhere deep in the sea. The sound was faint, distorted, as if echoing from the bottom of the ocean. Soft, distant bell rings faintly, underwater effect. Father Armitage turned pale. He told the boys to stop ringing immediately. The bells swung once more before going still. The fog outside didn't move. No wind, no sound, just silence. The villagers stepped outside, uneasy. One man, a fisherman named Thomas Vale, said he could still hear the second bell faintly beneath the waves. He pointed toward the water and swore he saw something moving, like a shadow rising from beneath the surface. The priest scolded him, told everyone to go home and pray. By evening, the fog finally began. The sea seemed louder, angrier. At night, villagers heard strange vibrations in their walls, like a hum running beneath the ground. Sometimes the church bell tower would creak, even when there was no wind. Father Armitage grew quieter. He stopped holding services. He started walking alone to the cliffs at dawn, whispering prayers no one could hear. Hen came the night of the storm. It started just after sunset. The sky turned almost black, and the wind came without warning, not a slow build, but a sudden, violent burst that made the island tremble. The waves crashed so high they sprayed over the cliffs. People barred their doors, gathered their children, and prayed. Inside the old church, something began to stir. The wind forced its way through the broken shutters, snuffing out every candle, and in that darkness, the ropes of the bell tower began to move. No one was there to ring them, but the bells began to move on their own. The first sound came as a single note, low and heavy, echoing across the cliffs. Then another, faster, and another. The villagers heard it through the storm. Some ran to the windows, others covered their ears. It wasn't the sound of worship. It was desperate, uneven, like something trapped was struggling to break free. The storm grew worse. Lightning struck the tower, lighting up the night for a split second, and in that flash, a few people claimed they saw something. A shadow, tall and twisted, standing inside the bell tower, hands gripping the ropes. But there was no one there when the lightning faded. Inside the church, the air shimmered with heat and salt. Father Armitage arrived, soaked from the rain, shouting prayers as he climbed the stairs to the tower. He said later, in his journal, that he felt something pulling against him, like invisible hands pushing him back. When he reached the top, both bells were swinging wildly, the ropes snapping against the beams. Blue light flickered around the metal, pulsing like veins. And beneath the thunder, he heard voices, not human voices, deeper, distorted, layered over each other like a chorus underwater. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was pleading, angry. He tried to grab the rope to stop the bells. The moment he touched it, the sound stopped. Everything went silent. No wind, no rain, no thunder, just stillness. Then, a single whisper behind him. When the villagers came the next morning, the storm had passed. Half the church roof was gone, the pews were splintered, and the bell tower door hung open. They searched for Father Armitage all day. They found his lantern near the stairs, still burning. His footprints led all the way up to the top of the tower, and stopped at the edge of the open window. There were no signs of a fall, no blood, no body, just one handprint burned into the wood, blackened as if from heat. After that night, no one dared go near the church again. They sealed the doors, nailed the tower shut, and left the bells where they hung. No one ever tried to ring them again. But on certain nights, when the sea fog drifts through the village, people say they can still hear the bells faintly in the distance, ringing slowly, like they're calling someone. From then on, the people of St. Helena stopped looking out to sea, because sometimes the sea looks back. Years passed, the storm faded into legend, and the church on the cliff became just another ruin. Grass grew over the graves, the stones crumbled, and the sea slowly swallowed the lower path. Crane stumbled to the window. The ocean was calm, almost glassy, but something was rising through it, a shape that caught the lantern's reflection. He couldn't tell if it was light or movement, only that it was coming closer. Then the whispers returned, louder now, surrounding him, pressing against his ears. He dropped the recorder and ran down the stairs, but every step echoed like he was running inside a hollow drum. At the door, he turned back once. The bells were still swinging, and between them hung a figure, faint, shimmering, like water given shape. It lifted its head, and the bells rang one last time. Sharp, single chime. Everything cuts to silence. The villagers heard that final toll all the way in the harbor. The sound rolled across the island and then vanished, swallowed by the sea. The next morning, the church was flooded up to the altar. Crane was gone. Only his recorder was found, lying in the mud beside the tower door. When they played it, there was nothing for the first few minutes, only static and wind. Then, just before the tape ended, came a voice. Not Crane's. A low whisper that said, "You woke me." Soft static fades. Ocean waves return, slow and distant. Narrator, quietly. After that, no one ever entered the church again. The authorities sealed it for good, and the people of St. Helena learned to listen carefully on foggy nights. Because sometimes, when the sea is still and the air is heavy, they swear they can hear those bells again, ringing from deep below the water. Decades passed after Edward Crane disappeared. The church on the cliffs was sealed again, this time with iron doors and concrete. Locals said the government ordered it closed for safety reasons, but the people who lived nearby knew better. They'd seen what happened to anyone who tried to disturb that place. Over the years, the legend of the silent bells became a story told to tourists, a bit of local color, a ghost tale for the curious. Most visitors laughed it off, until the videos started appearing online. Sound, faint typing, mouse clicks. A small group of travel vloggers arrived on St. Helena in 2017. They called their channel Urban Unearthed. Their plan was simple: explore the ruins, film at night, and see if the legends were true. Their last upload began like any other. The camera shook as they hiked up the cliffs, laughing, teasing each other, trying to sound brave. One of them, a woman named Claire, kept saying she felt dizzy, like the air was thicker near the church. They reached the gates just after sunset. The church stood exactly where it always had, broken and quiet, the tower still leaning toward the sea. The door to the bell tower was chained shut, rusted solid. Sound of a crowbar scraping metal. They joked as they broke the lock, but the moment the door opened, their laughter stopped. The camera's microphone picked it up first. A deep, low hum, almost too soft to hear. One of them said it felt like the ground itself was vibrating. Inside, they found the staircase leading up the tower. Every step echoed. The footage turned shaky as they climbed, the light from their flashlights flickering across the walls. Near the top, the camera caught something strange. Faint carvings on the stone, the same spirals and wave symbols that Edward Crane had drawn in his notebook more than 50 years earlier. Then the first bell came into view. It hung perfectly still, coated in dust. But when the cameraman panned closer, the metal shimmered, not from the light, but from within. The people of St. Helena learned to stay away. Children were warned never to go near the cliffs, and when the wind carried a faint metallic sound across the island, everyone shut their windows. They didn't speak about the bells anymore. But in 1963, someone new came to the island, a man named Edward Crane. Soft click of a typewriter key. Crane was a British historian, quiet and curious, who came to St. Helena to write about Napoleon's exile. But history has a way of finding its own storytellers. He was fascinated by the island's silence, the way the villagers avoided the western cliffs, the way the old maps all showed a church that no one seemed willing to talk about. When he asked locals about it, they changed the subject. One shopkeeper told him the church was cursed. Another said it was best left to the sea. Crane didn't believe in curses. He believed in facts, records, evidence. So he started digging, sound of paper shuffling, old pages turning. In the island's small archive, he found a stack of letters dated 1821, written by Father Armitage himself. They started out ordinary, full of weather notes and church attendance. But the last few pages were different. The handwriting grew shaky, frantic. One line stood out: "The bells were never meant for us. The sea calls when they ring. Soft wind hums in the background." Crane grew obsessed. He hired a local guide, a man named Samuel, to take him to the ruins of the old church. The guide refused at first, but money has a way of dulling fear. They set out at dawn, following a path long overgrown with weeds and moss. The air felt heavier the closer they got. Even the birds stopped singing. When they reached the site, Crane was surprised to find the church still standing. Broken, yes, but not destroyed. The stone tower leaned slightly toward the ocean, its windows hollow like empty eyes. Inside, dust coated everything. The altar was cracked. The walls were covered in faded carvings, circles, lines, and strange symbols that didn't match anything Crane had seen before. At the far end stood the door to the bell tower. It was nailed shut with iron bars, blackened with age. Crane touched the wood. It was cold, not the kind of cold that comes from air, but from something deeper. Pause for 2 seconds. He took photos, sketches, and even chipped away part of the wall to study the markings. But that night, when he developed his photographs, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. In every picture of the bell tower, there was a faint blur, a shape, like someone standing behind the door, watching him. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light. But then he remembered what the old woman in the village had told him earlier that day. She had looked him dead in the eye and said, "You think the bells are just metal, don't you?" But they're not. They're mouths. And they've been hungry a long time. Low hum begins, unsettling tone. That night, Crane couldn't sleep. He sat in his room at the guest house, staring out at the cliffs. The wind howled through the shutters, and somewhere far off in the distance, he thought he heard something faint. One single bell. Just one. He told himself it was the wind, but deep down, he knew better. Bell tolls once, very faint and distant. The next morning he packed his equipment and told Samuel they were going back to the church. He said he wanted to see what was behind that tower door. Samuel begged him not to. Crane smiled and said, "History doesn't hide from fear. Some stories sleep quietly for a reason." But when Edward Crane pried open that door, he didn't just find the past. He found something that had been waiting for him. Edward Crane returned to the old church the next evening. The sun was sinking behind the cliffs, turning the sky the color of bruised metal. His guide, Samuel, refused to follow this time. He stopped halfway up the hill and crossed himself. "If you hear the bells," Samuel said, "run." Crane only nodded and kept walking. Footsteps on gravel, echoing. Inside the church, the air smelled of salt and mildew. The floor was damp, as if the ocean had breathed through the cracks. His lantern threw long shadows up the stone walls. They moved when he moved, but one of them didn't. He tried not to notice. He unpacked his recorder, his notebook, and a small crowbar. He was going to open the tower door. He told himself it was for research, that the stories of curses and voices were nonsense. But his hands were shaking, soft creak of metal being pried loose. It took him 15 minutes to pry the nails out. When the final bar fell away, a rush of air escaped, cold, wet, and heavy, with the smell of rust. It was like opening a tomb. He stepped inside. The stairs wound upward in a narrow spiral, slick with moss. Each step echoed twice, once under his boots and again from somewhere above. When he reached the top, he found them. The bells. 2 of them, Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next one. Bye for now.